It's 1996. Two researchers, Stanley and William Danko, are sitting in a modest living room in suburban Dallas. Across from them sits Bob, a 52-year-old man wearing a wrinkled polo shirt and jeans that have seen better days. His watch, a $15 Timex. His car outside, a 7-year-old Honda Accord with a small dent in the front bumper. Bob just told them his net worth is $2.3 million. The researchers had been conducting interviews like this for over a decade, and every single time they were shocked. They'd expected to meet millionaires in penthouse offices, driving Ferraris, wearing Rolex watches. Instead, they found themselves in middle-class neighborhoods, talking to people who looked like they worked at the local hardware store. This wasn't supposed to be how wealth looked in America. Stanley and Danko had started their research with a simple question. Who are the wealthy in America, and how did they get that way? What they discovered would shatter everything we thought we knew about money, success, and the American dream. They interviewed over 1,000 millionaires across the country, from Seattle to Miami, from farm towns to big cities, and the pattern they found was so consistent, so surprising, that it would change how we think about wealth forever. Because here's what they discovered: the flashy, expensive lifestyle we associate with being rich, it's actually the enemy of wealth. The people driving luxury cars, living in mansions, wearing designer everything, most of them are broke. Or worse, they're drowning in debt, trapped in golden handcuffs, desperately trying to maintain an image that's slowly destroying them financially. Meanwhile, the real millionaires, the ones with actual wealth, were hiding in plain sight. They were your neighbors, your co-workers, the quiet couple at the grocery store using coupons. They had cracked a code that everyone else had missed entirely. Today, I'm going to tell you their stories, real stories of real people who built extraordinary wealth in the most ordinary ways. Stories that will change how you think about money forever. Chapter 2. The Great Deception, Sarah's Story. Let me tell you about Sarah Martinez. The researchers met her during their study in Phoenix, Arizona. Sarah was a 45-year-old government employee. Not exactly the career you'd expect to produce millionaires. She made $67,000 a year, lived in a modest 3-bedroom house she bought in 1989, and drove a Toyota Camry she'd owned for 8 years. When Sarah told them her net worth was $1, $4 million, they almost didn't believe her. But then she told them her story. Sarah had started working for the city at age 22, making just $28,000 a year. While her friends were buying new cars, taking exotic vacations, and moving to trendy apartments, Sarah made a different choice. She decided to live like she was still making $28,000, even as her salary grew. Every raise, every bonus, every extra dollar went straight into investments. Not flashy stocks or risky ventures, just boring mutual funds that tracked the stock market. Month after month, year after year, Sarah quietly built her wealth, while everyone around her thought she was just getting by. The twist? Sarah's sister, Elena, lived just 15 minutes away. Elena was a pharmaceutical sales rep, making $95,000 a year, almost $30,000 more than Sarah. Elena drove a brand-new BMW, lived in a luxury apartment complex, and took 2 international vacations every year. Elena looked successful. Elena looked wealthy. Elena's net worth? Negative $23,000. While Sarah had been quietly building wealth, Elena had been building debt, the BMW payment, the luxury rent, the credit card bills from those vacations. It had all added up. Elena made more money, but had less wealth. She looked rich, but was actually poor. This story played out thousands of times in the researchers' interviews. The pattern was undeniable. The people who looked wealthy usually weren't. The people who were actually wealthy usually didn't look it. They discovered there were really two types of people in America: those who looked rich and those who were rich. And tragically, these were almost never the same people. Chapter 3. The Janitor Millionaire. Frank's incredible journey. The most shocking story the researchers uncovered was Frank Kowalski's. Frank was a janitor at a Detroit auto plant for 32 years. When they interviewed him in 1994, just 2 years into his retirement, Frank was worth $1.8 million. A janitor with almost $2 million. Frank's story began in 1962 when he was 23 years old, newly married, and starting his job at the plant. His salary, $4,200 a year. Frank and his wife, Marie, lived in a tiny 2-bedroom house that cost $8,900, a house they would live in for the next 45 years. Here's what Frank did that changed everything. In 1965, the auto plant started offering a retirement plan where employees could contribute a percentage of their salary, and the company would match it. Most of Frank's coworkers ignored it. Who has money to spare on $4,200 a year? They said. But Frank and Marie made a pact. They would live on 85% of Frank's income, no matter how much he made, and invest the other 15%. When Frank's salary went from $4,200 to $5,000, they didn't upgrade their lifestyle. When it went to $8,000, then $15,000, then eventually to $45,000 in his final years, they kept living on 85% and investing 15%. For 30 years, Frank's money sat in the stock market, growing quietly. He never checked it obsessively. He never tried to time the market. He just kept adding money every month and let compound interest work its magic. The researchers calculated that Frank had contributed about $180,000 of his own money over those 30 years. But because of compound growth and his company's matching contributions, that $180,000 had become $1.8 million. Meanwhile, Frank's co-workers, many of whom had made the same salary or more, were struggling financially in retirement. They'd spent every raise on a nicer car, a bigger house, better vacations. They looked more successful during their working years, but Frank had the last laugh. The researchers asked Frank why he lived so modestly when he could afford so much more. His answer was simple. I never wanted to worry about money. I figured if I lived below my means long enough, eventually, I wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. Frank Kowalski, the janitor millionaire, had understood something that escaped most Americans. Wealth isn't about what you spend. It's about what you keep. Chapter 4. The Professor's Paradox. When high income meets low wealth road. Richard Harrison was everything you'd expect from a wealthy person. He was a professor at a prestigious university, drove a Mercedes-Benz, lived in a beautiful colonial home in an upscale neighborhood and sent his 3 children to private schools. His annual income? $145,000, well above the national average. When the researchers calculated Dr. Harrison's expected net worth based on his age and income, he should have had around $725,000. His actual net worth? $85,000. Dr. Harrison was what the researchers called a UAW, an underaccumulator of wealth. Despite his high income and impressive lifestyle, he was actually wealth poor. The story of how Dr. Harrison got trapped is one that millions of Americans can relate to. It started innocently enough. When he got his first professor job at age 28, making $35,000, he bought a modest car and rented a small apartment. But as his income grew, so did his expectations. At $45,000, he bought his first Mercedes, used, but still a Mercedes. "I need to look successful," he told himself. At $65,000, he bought the colonial house. "My children deserve a nice neighborhood," he reasoned. At $85,000 came the private school tuition. Education is an investment, he justified. Each decision made sense in isolation, but together they created a financial prison. Dr. Harrison's lifestyle expenses had grown to consume 98% of his income. He was saving just 2%, nowhere near enough to build significant wealth. The cruel irony? Dr. Harrison taught economics. He understood compound interest, investment theory, and financial planning better than most people. But knowledge without discipline is useless. Meanwhile, the researchers interviewed Maria Gonzalez, a public school teacher in the same city. Maria made $52,000 a year, less than half of Dr. Harrison's income. She drove a 6-year-old Honda Civic, lived in a modest townhouse, and sent her daughter to public school. Maria's net worth? $310,000. Despite making far less money, Maria was on track to retire as a millionaire, while Dr. Harrison, with his impressive income and lifestyle, was headed for financial struggle in his golden years. The difference wasn't intelligence, education, or even opportunity. The difference was discipline. Maria had learned to live below her means. Dr. Harrison had learned to live at his means, and sometimes beyond them. This story repeated itself hundreds of times in the researchers' interviews. High-income professionals trapped by their own success, while modest-income earners built substantial wealth through discipline and patience. Chapter 5. The Small Business Secret. How Ordinary Entrepreneurs Became Wealthy. One of the most surprising discoveries in the research was where America's millionaires actually worked. The researchers expected to find them in law firms, investment banks, and Fortune 500 companies. Instead, they found them running small, unglamorous businesses that most people had never heard of. Take the story of Jim Patterson. Jim owned a small janitorial supply company in Cleveland, Ohio. His business wasn't sexy. He sold mops, cleaning chemicals, and paper towels to offices and restaurants. Jim never appeared in business magazines. He never gave speeches at conferences. Most people didn't even know his business existed. But Jim was worth $4.2 million. Jim's story began in 1978, when he was laid off from his factory job. Instead of looking for another job, Jim noticed something. Cleveland had hundreds of small offices and restaurants, and they all needed cleaning supplies. Most were buying from large national suppliers who didn't pay much attention to small customers. Jim saw an opportunity. He started small, buying cleaning supplies wholesale and reselling them to local businesses. His advantage wasn't lower prices. It was better service. Jim knew his customers personally. He delivered supplies when they needed them. He solved problems that big suppliers ignored. The business grew slowly but steadily. After 5 years, Jim was making $45,000 a year, about what he'd made at the factory. But here's what was different. Jim owned an asset that was growing in value. Every year, his customer base expanded. Every year, his business became worth more. Jim reinvested most of his profits back into the business and into simple stock market investments. He didn't live lavishly. He drove used pickup trucks, lived in the same middle-class house for 20 years, and rarely took vacations. By the time the researchers interviewed him, Jim's janitorial supply business was generating $180,000 in annual profit, and the business itself was worth over $800,000. Combined with his stock investments, Jim had built a fortune of over $4 million selling mops and toilet paper. The researchers found similar stories everywhere they looked. There was Betty Chen, who owned 3 dry cleaners and was worth $2.1 million. There was Carlos Rodriguez, who owned a small trucking company and was worth $1.9 million. There was Susan Walsh, who owned a pet grooming business and was worth $1.4 million. None of these businesses were glamorous. None would make headlines or win awards. But they all had something in common. They solved real problems for real customers, generated steady cash flow, and could be grown over time. The millionaire business owners had discovered something that employees often miss. When you own a business, you're not just earning income. You're building an asset, and assets, over time, become wealth. Chapter 6. The Inheritance Myth. Why wealthy kids often become poor adults. One of the biggest myths about wealth is that most rich people inherited their money. The research revealed something shocking. 80% of millionaires are first-generation wealthy. They didn't inherit it. They built it themselves. Even more surprising, many people who do inherit money end up poorer than if they'd never inherited anything at all. The researchers discovered this through the heartbreaking story of the Johnson family. Robert Johnson had built a successful accounting firm over 30 years, accumulating a net worth of $3.2 million by the time he retired in 1985. Robert had grown up poor during the Depression and understood the value of money. He lived modestly, invested wisely, and built substantial wealth. Robert had 3 children, Michael, Jennifer, and David. When Robert died in 1992, he left each child approximately $1 million. The researchers tracked what happened to the Johnson children over the following decade. The results were devastating. Michael, the eldest, used his inheritance to start a high-end restaurant. He'd always dreamed of being a restaurateur, but he'd never worked in the industry. Within 3 years, the restaurant had failed, taking most of Michael's inheritance with it. By 2002, Michael's net worth was $47,000, less than many people his age who'd never inherited anything. Jennifer used her inheritance to upgrade her lifestyle dramatically. She bought a luxury condo, a new BMW, and began taking expensive vacations. She felt wealthy So she spent like she was wealthy, but she never invested her inheritance or used it to generate income. By 2002, Jennifer had spent through most of her inheritance and had a net worth of $180,000. Only David, the youngest, used his inheritance wisely. Instead of changing his lifestyle, David invested the $1 million in a diversified portfolio and continued living modestly on his teacher's salary. By 2002, David's inheritance had grown to $1.6 million. The researchers discovered that this pattern repeated itself constantly. They called it economic outpatient care, when wealthy parents financially support their adult children, often making them less wealthy in the long run. Here's why inheritance often backfires. Building wealth requires discipline, patience, and the ability to delay gratification. These are skills that must be developed through experience. When someone inherits money without developing these skills, they often lack the discipline to preserve and grow that wealth. The researchers found that the children of wealthy parents often had higher expenses and lower savings rates than their peers. They became accustomed to a high standard of living, but never learned how to generate the income to support it independently. The most successful wealthy families were those who taught their children the skills that created the wealth in the first place. Living below their means investing consistently and building assets over time. Money without these skills was often more of a curse than a blessing. Chapter 7. The Investment Wisdom. How millionaires think about money. The researchers expected to find that millionaires had sophisticated investment strategies, secret stock tips, or inside information. What they found was the opposite. Most millionaires kept their investments surprisingly simple. The story of Margaret Thompson perfectly illustrates this principle. Margaret was a nurse who worked at the same hospital in Portland, Oregon, for 38 years. She never made more than $55,000 in any single year. When she retired in 1995 at age 62, her net worth was $1.9 million. Margaret's investment strategy was almost boring in its simplicity. Starting in 1965, she put 15% of every paycheck into her hospital's retirement plan. The money went into just 3 investments: a stock fund that tracked the S&P 500, a bond fund, and an international stock fund. That's it. No hot stocks, no complicated strategies, no attempts to time the market. For 30 years, Margaret never changed her strategy. When the market crashed in 1987, she kept investing. When it soared in the early 1990s, she kept investing. She never tried to guess if stocks were too high or too low. She just kept putting money in, month after month, year after year. Margaret's secret wasn't brilliance. It was consistency. She had learned that time was more important than timing. She understood that getting rich slowly was better than trying to get rich quickly. The researchers found that most millionaires followed Margaret's approach. They invested consistently in simple, low-cost funds that tracked broad market indexes. They didn't try to pick individual stocks or chase the latest investment fad. But here's what made them different from most investors. They had incredible patience. While other people panicked during market downturns or got greedy during market bubbles, the millionaires stayed the course. They understood something that most people miss. The stock market goes up and down in the short term, But over 20 to 30 years, it trends consistently upward. Companies grow, economies expand, and patient investors get rewarded. The researchers also discovered that most millionaires were incredibly risk-averse when it came to speculation. They didn't day trade. They didn't put money into risky investments they didn't understand. They didn't chase get-rich-quick schemes. Instead, they focused on boring investments that had proven track records over decades: broad stock market funds, bonds, and real estate. They understood that building wealth was like growing a tree. It happened slowly, but with patience and consistency, it becomes something impressive. This philosophy extended beyond just investments. The millionaires approached their entire financial lives with the same patience and discipline. They built wealth the way a mason builds a wall, one brick at a time, with careful attention to the foundation. Chapter 8: The Neighborhood Effect. Why Location Shapes Wealth. One of the most fascinating discoveries was how dramatically neighborhood choice affected wealth building. The researchers found that millionaires often lived in modest neighborhoods, while people in expensive neighborhoods often had surprisingly little wealth. This discovery came to life through the story of two couples, the Andersons and the Williamses. Both couples were the same age, had similar incomes, and worked in the same city. But their neighborhood choices led them down completely different financial paths. The Andersons chose to live in Westbrook Estates, an upscale subdivision where the average home cost $450,000. The neighborhood was beautiful: manicured lawns, luxury cars in every driveway, and residents who all seemed successful and wealthy. But the researchers discovered something disturbing about Westbrook Estates. It was a wealth trap. The expensive homes came with expensive property taxes, expensive maintenance, and expensive social expectations. The Andersons found themselves under constant pressure to keep up with their neighbors. When the neighbors bought luxury cars, the Andersons felt pressure to upgrade their own vehicles. When neighbors remodeled their kitchens, the Andersons felt their own home looked dated. When neighbors sent their children to expensive private schools, the Andersons worried about their children being left behind. The result? Despite earning $125,000 annually, the Andersons saved less than 3% of their income. After 15 years in Westbrook Estates, their net worth was just $78,000. The Williamses made a different choice. They chose to live in Maple Grove, a middle-class neighborhood where the average home cost $180,000. The homes were nice, but not spectacular. The cars and driveways were reliable, but not luxurious. The neighbors were comfortable, but not wealthy. In Maple Grove, the Williamses felt no pressure to overspend. Their home was one of the nicer ones in the neighborhood. Their cars were newer than most. Their lifestyle felt abundant rather than inadequate. This psychological difference was crucial. The Williamses saved 18% of their income because they never felt like they needed more. After 15 years in Maple Grove, their net worth was $425,000. The researchers called this the neighborhood effect. They found that people who lived in expensive neighborhoods often saved less money, even when they earned more. The constant comparison to wealthy neighbors created a psychological pressure to spend that was hard to resist. Millionaires had discovered an important secret. It's better to be the richest person in a modest neighborhood than the poorest person in a wealthy neighborhood. They chose neighborhoods where they could live comfortably without financial strain, where their children could get good educations without breaking the bank, and where they didn't feel constant pressure to upgrade their lifestyle. This wasn't about being cheap or settling for less. It was about being strategic. The millionaires understood that your neighborhood choice shapes your spending patterns, which shapes your ability to build wealth. They chose neighborhoods that supported their wealth-building goals rather than undermining them. Chapter 9. The Legacy Question. What wealth really means. As the researchers concluded their study, they realized they had uncovered something much deeper than just how people build wealth. They had discovered two fundamentally different approaches to life in America. The final story that captures this difference is about two men who worked at the same company for their entire careers, William Hayes and Robert Chen. Both started as engineers in 1968 at a large aerospace company in Seattle. Both retired in 1998 with similar salaries and pensions. William Hayes had always believed that the purpose of money was to buy happiness today. He lived in a beautiful home, drove luxury cars, took expensive vacations, and gave his children every advantage money could buy. William looked successful, and he felt in. His friends envied his lifestyle. When William retired at age 65, his net worth was $127,000, mostly his home equity. His retirement income from Social Security and his pension would be enough to maintain a modest lifestyle, but nothing close to what he'd enjoyed during his working years. William realized he would need to dramatically downsize his life in retirement. Robert Chen had always believed that the purpose of money was to buy freedom tomorrow. He lived modestly, saved aggressively, and invested patiently. Robert didn't look particularly successful. His house was ordinary, his car was practical, and his vacations were budget-friendly. But Robert never worried about money because he knew he was building something bigger than lifestyle. He was building independence. When Robert retired at age 65, his net worth was $4 million. His investment income alone was more than his old salary. Robert had achieved something that William never would: true financial freedom. He could live however he chose, travel wherever he wanted, and help his children and grandchildren without financial stress. The researchers realized that William and Robert represented two different philosophies about wealth and life. William had chosen consumption over accumulation. Robert had chosen accumulation over consumption. Neither choice is inherently right or wrong, but they lead to dramatically different outcomes. William had enjoyed a higher lifestyle during his working years, but faced financial constraints in retirement. Robert had lived modestly during his working years, but gained financial freedom for the rest of his life. The millionaires in the study had all made Robert's choice. They had sacrificed some consumption today to gain freedom tomorrow. They understood that wealth isn't really about money, it's about options. It's about the ability to make choices based on what you want to do rather than what you can afford to do. As one millionaire told the researchers, "I don't feel rich because of what I can buy. I feel rich because I don't have to worry about money. I can focus on what really matters: my family, my health, my relationships, my contribution to the world. Money can't buy happiness, but financial security sure eliminates a lot of stress and opens up a lot of possibilities. The Millionaire Next Door isn't really about becoming wealthy. It's about becoming free. Free from financial stress, free from having to take jobs you hate, free from worrying about your children's education or your retirement, free to live life on your own terms. And perhaps most importantly, the research showed that this freedom is available to almost anyone willing to make the choices that lead to it. You don't need to be brilliant or lucky or born into wealth. You just need to be disciplined and patient. The millionaire next door could be you. The question is, are you willing to make the choices today that will create the freedom you want tomorrow? Your wealthy future is waiting for you to decide.